who are the guys you should be picking up now before everybody else in your league is on them? I'm about to tell you. Welcome back to the Fantasy Endgame. I'm Pierre, here to help you once again with some waiver wire pickups that you might want to be looking at, even though they're not hot pickups for week 9. These are the guys you should be stashing ahead of time, so that way you don't have to worry about bidding up on them and you're going to be thankful later on. Now, with the trade deadline come and gone, you'd think there'd be a lot of new names popping up with guys who have a path to playing time that might be fantasy relevant. That's not really the case. A lot of these moves, even though you got some faces in new places, they are just kind of whatever deals. It didn't really open up a spot. Look, TJ Hawkinson going to the Vikings. Are we really adding the tight end for Detroit, who I believe is Brock Wright? No, you're not. Are you going to add a wide receiver who's going to take Chase Claypool's spot in Pittsburgh as the number 3 target there? I don't think so. But there is one name that is interesting, and this is a name you should be familiar with, a guy who was drafted really high this year, and that is Elijah Mitchell of the 49ers. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute. Probably the biggest trade that happened was Christian McCaffrey going to the 49ers. That should pretty much kill Mitchell's value. Well, it sort of does, but not necessarily, because obviously Mitchell is not going to be the starter when he returns, but he's now the clear RB2 because Jeff Wilson, who had been the starter in his place throughout most of the season, was shipped to Miami. So that means with, Mitchell coming back after the bye, the 49ers not playing this week, Mitchell is set to return. He's going to be the clear backup. He'll see some carries, but this makes him a high-end handcuff. And for those unfamiliar with what that means basically if CMC goes down, hopefully not, but that means you got a guy who's waiting in the wings, who steps up and has immediate value. And so you want him on your bench, especially if you have McCaffrey on your team. You definitely want to have Mitchell somewhere stashed on your bench. So that way you really don't miss a beat. You have the starter for the 49ers. Look, we know what Elijah Mitchell can do in one season. 4.7 yards per carry, almost ran for 1,000 yards in only 10 starts. Okay, now, of course, the downside is injuries. Got banged up last year a little bit, and again, this year has missed almost the entire season. And that was kind of the knock on him because he's not a big guy, and he supposedly bulked up in the offseason, and it did no good. He got hurt in week 1. All right, but still, he should be healthy. You know what? He's going to get some run, but really his only value is as a backup. But again, let me say it, out of all the running backs that you really can't be putting in a starting lineup on a weekly basis from next week on, he has the highest value of all these backup running backs, who are also known as insurance policies or handcuffs. So if Mitchell is out there, especially if you already have CMC, this is the time to grab him because, again, nobody's adding him during his bye week. He's not going to play, and even when he comes back, nobody's excited for him to come back because, they got McCaffrey there. But the smart thing is to look ahead. If the worst happens, you will actually reap the benefits. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I said you should be adding Josh Palmer because we knew the Chargers were going to be on bye, so nobody's really looking for guys like that. And Mike Williams had just gone out with a high ankle sprain. He's going to be out multiple weeks, so that was a smart add. And sure enough, Palmer should probably be in your starting lineup this week if you're in a deep enough league. Well, now let's go even further down the depth chart here. It looks like Keenan Allen, who you'd think would be back and even healthier coming off a bye week, you'd think that he'd be playing, but somehow during his week off, he got worse with that hamstring injury, and now he's in danger of playing. He didn't practice on Wednesday. It's looked like, that injury is not getting any better, and this is a guy who's been around the league for a few years. So imagine if their top 2 receivers are both out. We're looking at a starting duo of Josh Palmer and DeAndre Carter. Now, Carter actually made some noise in week 1, even with those guys active. He had 64 yards and 3 catches. He was doing better, and a touchdown. He was doing better than Josh Palmer initially, and then he's kind of just taken a back seat. He's been active. He's had at least a catch in every game. This is a guy who does have, 19 catches on the year. He's got 28 targets. Nothing to write home about, but if you can imagine both Keenan Allen and Mike Williams sitting. And the other thing is, oh, by the way, if you really need a streamer for this week, this is a good chance to roll them out because they're playing the Falcons, which is the worst pass defense in the league, which is why you have to love Josh Palmer this week. But looking ahead, still no Mike Williams for multiple weeks. Keenan Allen, what if he just doesn't get right? Hamstrings can be tricky. They linger, as we've seen. And so DeAndre Carter might have weekly value going forward. For who knows how long. Could be 3-4 weeks. So you want a wide receiver who's tied to Justin Herbert, an offense that is still going to need to pass a lot because that defense has not come along the way they expected. Carter is a good stash, but you know what? I'm going to say he's actually a good streamer for right now if you need a receiver. Palmer is the priority ad, but looking ahead, you might want to take a chance on Carter as well. Another player who is on bye in week 9 is David Njoku, and this is a guy, unfortunately, you had to drop if you had him. A lot of people just had to let him go not because of the bye week, but because he also had an ankle injury, supposed to miss a couple of weeks, and you can't afford to necessarily stash a tight end because you just need someone to start, and with all these heavy bye weeks, this roster space is valuable. Njoku was not put on IR, so in a lot of leagues, he's not eligible to go in an IR slot. So if he was released, now's the time to pick him up if you can afford it, because it looks like after this week he has a good shot. It's not guaranteed, but he has a good shot to come back in week 10, and I would think at the latest maybe week 11. There was some thought he may be ready last week. Of course, that wasn't realistic, but anyways, Njoku has been really good. It's funny because a lot of people kind of made fun of Cleveland for giving him money and giving that contract to him before the season because he hadn't really done much in his career. And so far, what is he? He's a tight end 8 in fantasy on the season. That means he had become an every week starter pretty much until the injury. Now look, there's just not a lot there in Cleveland to throw to because there's Amari Cooper, the number 2 receiver, Donovan Peoples-Jones, a talented player, but not a guy who's necessarily a target hog. And that's kind of it. I mean, rookie David Bell, not ready yet. They're not really throwing it a lot to the running backs. Kareem Hunt, for some reason, didn't trade him, but they're also really not using him a lot, even as a pass catcher, whatever the reason is. So, yeah, Njoku is still going to be super valuable, especially at such a hard position to get a reliable option. So if Njoku is out there and you don't have an elite tight end, I'd say it is definitely worth a roster spot. I know this week is really heavy with the buys, and you probably are struggling as it is. But again, if you're in that position, you know what? Take a chance and put him on your bench rather than taking a flyer on some other guy who might get you 2 points in week 9. And then the second call here for Kyren Williams. Of course, you heard his name surface when it sounded like Cam Akers might get traded. Cam Akers didn't get traded, but he's still not necessarily guaranteed to play with the Rams. Who knows what is going on with that situation? Now all of a sudden they're all friendly again. Who knows? Look, he's probably just going to get released or just sit on the bench. But you know what Sean McVay does? He plays the guys that he likes. He doesn't like Darrell Henderson. It's very obvious, right? And you know what? He hasn't really given a lot of reason to this year. He's averaging less than 4 yards per carry. The backfield was his. The job was given to him, and he's really done not much with it. Maybe not all his fault. That offensive line is one of the worst in the league this year. But still, Darrell Henderson is not somebody who's going to stave off a challenge from any other player. So if Kyren Williams finally is back, and again, not sure when that window is really going to open for him to start practicing in full and to play, but it should be pretty soon. We know McVay talked him up all preseason. He's a guy he seems to like. He definitely can catch the ball, and maybe that's the answer. Maybe they find a guy who really is prolific at catching out of the backfield. Stafford can get some of those easy dump offs, relieve some pressure because he's always getting pressure in his face. Maybe that's his value, and that's definitely something you look for in a PPR league. So Kyren Williams, again, I'm not going to go out and add him if I really need that position for a guy who might be playing in the next week or two. But again, if you have deep enough benches, this is a guy that could have some upside when it matters most late in the season. All right, and then finally, I think it's time. I mentioned with David Njoku, you've got to like the fact that he's been productive all season, but there's one other reason to like Njoku for the rest of this season, and that's because only a few weeks from now, he's getting Deshaun Watson as his quarterback. So I think if you're in the right situation where, look, you're struggling at quarterback because you've been rolling with a guy like Rodgers or Stafford, somebody just underwhelming, there's just not a lot out there. You hate streaming guys like Justin Fields and Daniel Jones each week and don't know what you're getting. Go ahead and take a chance, stash Deshaun Watson, and wait for him to come back. So here's the thing with Watson, and I know there is some concern that, look, he hasn't played all year, and he really doesn't have any chemistry with these Cleveland players, but the schedule, and that's what matters most. In Week 13, of course, you already know this, is facing his former team, and that is the Houston Texans. Even in his first game back, it's pretty obvious. The motivation will be there. It's a great matchup, but also I'm pretty sure they're going to let him let it fly. After that, kind of a tough matchup going on the road to Cincinnati, but then we get into where it's basically the fantasy playoffs for a lot of you. The next 4 games are all against teams that are in the bottom half of the league in terms of passing yards allowed. And the only one who kind of is barely right there in the margin, squeak by, is the Saints. And that's just because last week the Raiders just did nothing against them. But they have been a bottom half pass defense all year. You're talking about Baltimore, which is one of the worst pass defenses in the league. You got New Orleans, you got Washington. And if you're in one of these leagues that happens to play in the final week of the season for your fantasy championship, it's even better. You get to play against Pittsburgh, who will probably just be tanking at that point. So, look, Deshaun Watson is a proven commodity. We know this. He's got one of the best offensive lines in front of him, far better than he's ever had in Houston. He's got the best running game to support him that he's ever had already. The weapons aren't elite, but look, Amari Cooper, Peoples-Jones, like I mentioned, Njoku, that's good enough. And you have a guy at the very least, who doesn't make a lot of mistakes. If you need a quarterback, again, you're somebody who's been streaming, going back and forth, looking for a consistent option, you know what? Deshaun Watson might be the guy that helps you when you need it most. All right, those are my early waiver wire picks. Now heading into week 9. Of course, you can check out my priority waiver wire picks, all our trade advice, start sit advice, and everything you need to help you win on our playlist right here. And of course, don't miss us live every Saturday night with start sit advice.